The fate of a nation often hinges on information, on what commanders know, when they know it, and how they act upon it. In the sweltering June of 1863, as Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia slipped northward through the Shenandoah Valley, this truth would prove decisive in ways neither side could yet imagine. Colonel George Sharp leaned over the map spread across his field desk, his finger tracing the winding path of the Potomac River. As head of the newly formed Bureau of Military Information, the Union's first organized intelligence service, his thoughts were consumed by a single question. Where was Lee taking his army? Reports remain contradictory, General, Sharp explained to Major General Joseph Hooker, commander of the Army of the Potomac. But our signal stations have observed significant Confederate movement through the gaps in the Blue Ridge. Hooker's face revealed nothing. After the disaster at Chancellorsville just weeks earlier, where Lee had outmaneuvered him despite being outnumbered more than 2-1, the Union commander understood his very command hung in the balance. He needed intelligence, and he needed it quickly. According to historical accounts published in the National Intelligence Quarterly, the Bureau of Military Information represented a revolutionary approach to battlefield intelligence that would forever change American military doctrine. What neither man understood was that Lee himself was operating partially blind. After the death of the legendary cavalry commander Jeb Stuart's chief scout, Captain William Blackford had remarked to his commander, "We've lost our eyes, General." Stuart had nodded grimly, knowing that Lee depended on him to be the eyes of the Army. Meanwhile, in a farmhouse near Fredericksburg, Confederate signal operators decoded messages intercepted from Union telegraph lines. Major General Jeb Stuart studied the reports with growing satisfaction. Hooker was uncertain, reactive rather than proactive. The moment to strike north had arrived. "Send word to General Lee," Stuart instructed. "Hooker remains south of the Rappahannock. He shows no sign of understanding our movement." As Lee's infantry columns wound northward through mountain passes, they moved behind a protective screen of cavalry. Stuart's horsemen swept the countryside, gathering intelligence while simultaneously preventing Union scouts from observing Confederate movements. This dance of information and misinformation would prove crucial in the coming weeks. In Washington, President Abraham Lincoln paced the floors of the White House, anxiety etching deeper lines into his already careworn face. "They are coming north," he told Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. "I feel it in my bones." Across the Potomac in Virginia, a network of civilian spies, known as the Gray Ghost Network, monitored the movements of Lee's army. Managed by the cunning Elizabeth Van Lew of Richmond, these operatives risked hanging to smuggle information to Union officials. One such report had just reached Sharp, suggesting that elements of Lee's force had already crossed into Maryland. By June 18th, Hooker finally grasped the situation's gravity. "Lee intends to invade the North," he telegraphed to Washington. But knowing Lee's general direction was far different from understanding his specific objectives. As dust clouds rose from thousands of marching feet and rolling wagon wheels, farmers in western Maryland and southern Pennsylvania watched with growing alarm. Some fled north with tales of the approaching rebel army. Others remained, becoming unwitting intelligence assets for both sides, as officers questioned them about roads, bridges, and the movements of enemy forces. In the small Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg, where 10 roads converged like spokes on a wheel, citizens went about their daily business unaware that within days, the armies would be drawn to this transportation hub, as if by some invisible gravitational force. The intelligence war unfolding would determine not just where they would meet, but who would hold the advantage when they did. The chess pieces were moving, though neither Lee nor Hooker fully understood the board. As June drew to a close, the most consequential battle of the Civil War approached, its location and outcome dependent on which commander could best pierce the fog of war. As June 22nd dawned, Jeb Stuart presented an audacious plan to Robert E. Lee at his headquarters, near Berryville, Virginia. With the main Confederate force already pushing northward, Stuart proposed taking his cavalry on a bold ride around the Union Army, as he had done twice before to great acclaim. "I can disrupt their communications, gather intelligence on their movements, and rejoin you as you cross into Pennsylvania," Stuart explained, his plumed hat placed carefully on the map table. Lee, stroking his beard thoughtfully, gave conditional approval. "You must maintain contact with our main body," he cautioned. "I will be without eyes if you stray too far or too long." What followed would become one of the most criticized cavalry operations of the war. According to General Walter Taylor's post-war memoirs, 4 years with General Lee, this fateful decision deprived the Confederate commander of his most valuable reconnaissance asset during the critical phase of the campaign. On June 25th, Stuart and 3 of his best cavalry brigades, some 5,000 troopers, set off on their ride. What should have been a quick movement around the Union Army soon became extended when Stuart encountered Union forces blocking his intended route. Rather than turn back, the cavalier pressed eastward, riding farther from Lee's army with each passing hour. Meanwhile, Union cavalry was undergoing a transformation of its own. For too long dismissed as inferior to their Southern counterparts, the Federal horsemen had new leadership under Brigadier General Alfred Pleasonton and new tactics that emphasized aggressive reconnaissance. Cavalry units under John Buford, Judson, Kilpatrick, and others began probing Confederate positions, gathering vital intelligence. "The rebel infantry is moving in force through Hagerstown," reported Captain Ulrich Dahlgren after a daring scout behind enemy lines. This information, quickly relayed to Hooker, confirmed that Lee's army was indeed pushing into Pennsylvania. On June 28th, as Lee established headquarters at Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, a remarkable incident occurred that would dramatically alter the coming battle. Henry Thomas Harrison, a Confederate spy, infiltrated the Union lines and learned that the Army of the Potomac was much closer than Lee realized, and under new leadership. Major General George Meade had replaced Hooker just hours earlier. Harrison rode through the night, reaching Lee with this crucial intelligence on the morning of June 29th. Lee, who had been operating under the assumption that the Union Army was still in Virginia, was visibly shocked. "General Longstreet," Lee addressed his old war horse commander, "the enemy is moving north more quickly than our intelligence suggested. We must concentrate our forces." Without Stuart's cavalry to verify Harrison's report, Lee was forced to make decisions based on limited information. He immediately sent orders for his scattered divisions to converge near Cashtown, Pennsylvania, abandoning plans to strike at Harrisburg. On the Union side, Meade faced his own intelligence challenges. Assuming command of an army while in pursuit of an elusive enemy, he needed to understand Lee's positions and intentions quickly. The Bureau of Military Information worked feverishly, compiling reports from scouts, signal stations, and civilian informants. "The rebel army is spread across south-central Pennsylvania," Colonel Sharp informed Meade, "but they appear to be concentrating westward of us." Meade deployed his cavalry aggressively to fill the intelligence void. Brigadier General John Buford's division rode northwest toward the crossroads town of Gettysburg. A veteran soldier with a keen tactical eye, Buford understood the value of good terrain. As June ended, both armies were converging like blind giants, each with incomplete knowledge of the other's exact positions. Stuart remained out of contact with Lee, riding far to the east, capturing Union supply wagons but gathering little of the strategic intelligence so desperately needed. The most critical intelligence of the campaign would come not from Stuart's grand ride, but from Buford's methodical reconnaissance. Entering Gettysburg on June 30th, his experienced eye immediately recognized the military value of the high ground south of town, the cemetery ridge and the hills beyond. "They'll come from that direction," he told his officers, pointing northwest toward Chambersburg, "and we must hold until the infantry arrives." Dawn broke hazy and warm over Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863. John Buford stood in the cupola of the Lutheran Seminary, telescope trained on the northwestern approaches to town. His scouts had reported Confederate infantry approaching along the Chambersburg Pike. "Lieutenant," Buford said to his signal officer, "send word to Reynolds. Tell him there's infantry coming, a considerable force." The message would alert Major General John Reynolds, commanding the Union First Corps several miles to the south, that contact with the enemy was imminent. Buford's decision to defend the approaches to Gettysburg rather than withdraw represented one of the most consequential reconnaissance judgments of the war. With barely 2,000 cavalrymen armed with breech-loading carbines, he prepared to delay a Confederate division until Union infantry could arrive. As documented in The Cavalry at Gettysburg by Edward Longacre, Buford's tactical assessment and defensive deployment may have been the pivotal intelligence action that secured victory for the Union forces. Meanwhile, Confederate Major General Henry Heth's division approached from the west, unaware of Buford's presence. Heth had sent a battalion toward Gettysburg the previous day in search of supplies, particularly shoes for his barefoot soldiers. They had withdrawn after encountering cavalry, but Heth was under the impression that only Pennsylvania militia occupied the town. General Heth reports minimal resistance ahead, a staff officer informed Lieutenant General A.P. Hill, Corps Commander. He believes it's just local militia. This intelligence failure, mistaking Buford's veteran cavalry for local militia, would have profound consequences. Hill authorized Heth to advance on Gettysburg, setting in motion the battle neither army had planned. What followed was a desperate holding action as Buford's cavalrymen fought dismounted along McPherson's Ridge, exploiting the rapid fire capability of their carbines to create the impression of a larger force. From his observation post, Buford tracked the Confederate deployment, noting the arrival of reinforcements and adjusting his thin defensive line accordingly. By mid-morning, as Buford's men neared exhaustion, dust clouds to the south heralded the approach of Reynolds' infantry. The intelligence Buford had sent had its desired effect. The Union First Corps was arriving at a crucial moment. Reynolds himself rode ahead of his troops, joining Buford at the seminary. "What's the situation, John?" he asked, as both men observed the battlefield through field glasses. "Heavy infantry force pushing from the west and northwest," Buford replied. "My men are holding, but not for much longer." Reynolds made a snap decision that would cost him his life, but buy precious time for the Union Army. "Hold on," he said. "My corps is coming." Within the hour, Reynolds would fall to a Confederate bullet, but his prompt response to Buford's intelligence saved the critical high ground south of town. As the battle escalated throughout the day, the value of Buford's initial reconnaissance became increasingly apparent. By identifying defensible terrain and accurately assessing Confederate strength and direction, he had provided vital time for the Union Army to concentrate. On the Confederate side, the absence of Stuart's cavalry continued to hamper Lee's decision-making. Without detailed knowledge of Union positions, Lee had ordered his scattered corps to concentrate, but had not intended to initiate a general engagement until his army was fully assembled. "Where is General Stuart?" Lee asked repeatedly, as reports of heavy fighting reached him at his headquarters. Without his cavalry commander's reconnaissance, he was forced to rely on information brought by couriers from the front, information that was often hours old by the time it reached him. By late afternoon, with more Union forces arriving and occupying the high ground of Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, the consequences of these intelligence disparities became clear. The Confederates had pushed the Union forces through the town, but had failed to secure the commanding terrain beyond. As night fell, Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, sent forward by Meade to take command after Reynolds's death, surveyed the fishhook-shaped ridge south of town. "This is good ground," he declared. "Very good ground." Intelligence and reconnaissance had shaped the first day's fighting in ways neither commander had anticipated. Buford's cavalry had bought critical time with accurate reporting and judicious delay. Lee, operating without Stuart's reconnaissance, had stumbled into a battle before his army was concentrated, and Hancock's quick assessment of the terrain had secured the Union position for the coming struggle. As July 2nd dawned, both armies continued to arrive on the battlefield. Lee, still without Stuart's cavalry for proper reconnaissance, sent staff officers to scout the Union position visually. Standing on Seminary Ridge, Lee and his generals observed the Union line stretching along Cemetery Ridge to their front. "Their right appears strong, posted on those hills," Lee noted, referring to Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. His gaze then turned southward. "What of their left?" This simple question, about the extension and strength of the Union left flank, would become the focus of Confederate reconnaissance efforts throughout the morning. Without Stuart's cavalry, Lee dispatched Captain Samuel R. Johnston of his engineering staff to investigate. Johnston, with a small escort, moved south along Seminary Ridge before turning east to probe toward the Round Tops, two prominent hills anchoring what he believed was the Union left. His reconnaissance, however, proved fatally flawed. Military historians writing in the Journal of the American Military Institute have long considered Johnston's incomplete reconnaissance one of the critical intelligence failures of the battle, as noted in Edwin Fischel's landmark work, The Secret War for the Union. "I observed no significant Union forces on the hill," Johnston reported upon his return, referring to Little Round Top. Whether due to the difficulty of the wooded terrain or simple oversight, Johnston had failed to detect that the Union line ended short of this critical high ground. Based on this incomplete intelligence, Lee formulated his attack plan. Lieutenant General James Longstreet would take his corps on a concealed march to strike what appeared to be an unanchored Union left flank. The assault would begin around noon on the Union side. Major General Daniel Sickles, commanding the 3rd Corps positioned on the southern portion of Cemetery Ridge, grew concerned about his placement. From his position, he could see higher ground to his front, the peach orchard and wheat field about 3/4 of a mile west of the ridge. Without proper reconnaissance to confirm what lay beyond, Sickles made the fateful decision to advance his corps to this higher ground, creating a salient in the Union line. He did so without Meade's explicit approval, believing he was improving his defensive position. Meanwhile, Meade was conducting a systematic inspection of his entire line, moving from Cemetery Hill southward. Union signal officers established a station on Little Round Top, providing observations of Confederate movements along Seminary Ridge, though dense woods concealed much of the Confederate activity. As Longstreet's troops conducted their circuitous march south, they had a near catastrophe. Brigadier General E.M. Law, commanding an Alabama brigade, recalled, "Our column was marching parallel to the Union line and barely a mile from it, hidden only by a screen of trees. Had Union cavalry been patrolling actively on their flank, the entire Confederate movement might have been detected early." Around 3 o'clock, nearly 3 hours later than Lee had intended, Longstreet's assault began. The delayed start had given the Union Army precious time, though they had failed to properly secure Little Round Top until the last moment. When the Confederate attack struck, it hit Sickles' exposed position hard. The intelligence failure was twofold. Johnston had missed the opportunity to identify Little Round Top's vulnerability, while Sickles had moved without proper reconnaissance of what forces he might face. The consequences unfolded dramatically. As Sickles' line collapsed under Confederate pressure, a desperate race began for Little Round Top. Colonel Strong Vincent's brigade, acting on intelligence from a signal officer who had spotted Confederate troops approaching the hill, rushed to secure the position just minutes before Confederates from Law's brigade attempted to seize it. "We must hold this ground," Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain told his 20th Maine Regiment, positioned on the extreme left of the Union line. "We are the end of the line." The desperate fighting that followed, Chamberlain's famous defense of Little Round Top, stemmed directly from these cascading intelligence failures and near misses. Had either side conducted more thorough reconnaissance, the day's fighting might have unfolded very differently. As darkness fell on July 2nd, the Union line bent but unbroken, Lee contemplated his options for the following day. Stuart had finally arrived late that afternoon, but the damage from his absence was already done. The critical reconnaissance period had passed. The battle's outcome now hinged on which commander could best assess the new situation, and whose intelligence assessment would prove more accurate in the decisive moments to come. The morning of July 3rd found both commanding generals analyzing intelligence and planning their next moves. Robert E. Lee, despite the previous day's setbacks, remained determined to break the Union line. The reports before him painted an incomplete picture: successful attacks on both flanks, yet neither decisive. Jeb Stuart, having finally rejoined the Army late on July 2nd, received sharp criticism from Lee. "General Stuart," Lee reportedly said, "where have you been? I have not heard from you for days, and you are the eyes and ears of my army." Stuart immediately set about making amends, conducting reconnaissance around the Union right flank. His cavalry moved east of Gettysburg, seeking opportunities to disrupt Union supply lines or create diversions to assist the main Confederate assault. On Cemetery Ridge, George Meade convened a war council in a small farmhouse that served as his headquarters. The intelligence from brigade and division commanders suggested the Confederates had tested both Union flanks and might next strike the center. "Where will they hit us tomorrow?" Meade asked his assembled generals. Brigadier General John Gibbon, whose division held the center of the Union line, responded prophetically, "If Lee attacks tomorrow, it will be on my front." This prediction rested on solid intelligence analysis. Union signal officers on Little Round Top had observed Confederate artillery being repositioned. Prisoners taken during the previous day's fighting had revealed that Pickett's fresh division had arrived on the field. These pieces, assembled by Colonel Sharp's Bureau of Military Information, pointed to a major assault against the Union center. The Harper's Weekly correspondent, who later interviewed Meade, noted that this correct prediction of Lee's intentions represented perhaps the most remarkable instance of battlefield intelligence assessment in American military history to that time. With this intelligence advantage, Meade strengthened his center, positioning artillery and shifting reserves where they could quickly reinforce any breakthrough. General Henry Hunt, Meade's artillery chief, carefully examined the ground, planning how best to counter the Confederate bombardment he anticipated would precede an attack. Lee, meanwhile, operated with less complete information. Reports from his subordinates indicated that the Union line had been weakened by the previous day's fighting. Without effective reconnaissance of the center of the Union position, he could not know that Meade had reinforced precisely where he planned to attack. "The enemy is there," Lee told General Longstreet, pointing toward Cemetery Ridge, "and I am going to strike him." Longstreet, unconvinced by the intelligence supporting this plan, voiced his concerns. "General Lee, I have been a soldier all my life. I have been with soldiers engaged in fights by couples, by squads, companies, regiments, divisions, and armies, and should know as well as anyone what soldiers can do. It is my opinion that no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position." Despite these objections, Lee ordered the assault. Major General George Pickett's division, along with troops from Hill's Corps, would make the main attack across nearly a mile of open ground. At 1 o'clock, the Confederate artillery opened fire in the largest bombardment of the war. For nearly 2 hours, over 150 guns hammered the Union center. The Federal artillery initially responded in kind, before Hunt ordered many guns to cease fire, both to conserve ammunition and to give the Confederates the false impression their bombardment had been effective. This deliberate deception worked. Confederate Artillery Chief E. Porter Alexander, unable to accurately assess the damage to Union batteries through the smoke, sent word to Pickett, "For God's sake, come quick, or my ammunition won't let me support you properly." Intelligence. Failures continued to plague the Confederate attack. The smoke-obscured battlefield prevented accurate assessment of Union positions. The assumption that the Federal line had been weakened proved catastrophically wrong. At 3 o'clock, nearly 15,000 Confederate soldiers emerged from the woods along Seminary Ridge in parade ground formation. What followed was one of the war's most famous assaults, Pickett's Charge. As the gray line advanced across the open fields, Union artillery reopened fire. Contrary to Confederate intelligence, the Federal guns had not been knocked out but had been waiting for this moment. Canister and shell tore holes in the advancing ranks. From his observation post on Little Round Top, Union signal officers provided real-time intelligence on the Confederate advance, allowing Meade to shift reinforcements exactly where needed. Assault briefly penetrated the Union line at what would become known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. But without proper intelligence on Union reserves, the Confederates were unprepared for the counterattack that quickly sealed the breach. As the survivors streamed back toward Seminary Ridge, Lee rode out to meet them. "It's all my fault," he told them. "It is I who have lost this fight." In the aftermath, Stuart's cavalry, attempting to reach the Union rear, was checked by Federal horsemen under Brigadier General David Gregg east of the main battlefield. This final reconnaissance failure completed the Confederate defeat. By evening, as rain began to fall, the consequences of 3 days of intelligence disparities had become clear. The Union victory at Gettysburg stemmed in no small part from better reconnaissance, more accurate intelligence assessment, and the ability to anticipate enemy movements. As rain drenched the battlefield on July 4th, Independence Day, both armies faced the consequences of the previous 3 days' fighting. Lee prepared his battered Army of Northern Virginia for the long retreat back to Virginia, while Meade cautiously consolidated his position, unsure whether Lee might attack again. The intelligence picture had reversed dramatically. Now it was the Union that suffered from incomplete reconnaissance as Meade hesitated to pursue aggressively. Despite urgings from Washington, he moved cautiously, allowing Lee's army to escape across the Potomac River by July 14th. "Our army held the war in the hollow of their hand and they would not close it," Lincoln lamented upon learning that Lee had escaped. The president understood what his generals sometimes did not, that intelligence was only valuable when acted upon decisively. In the aftermath of the battle, both armies conducted internal assessments of their intelligence operations. The Union's Bureau of Military Information under Colonel Sharp had proven its worth, providing Meade with accurate pictures of Confederate strength and positions throughout much of the campaign. According to documents preserved in the National Archives' Civil War Intelligence Collection, Meade wrote to Washington that the information provided by Colonel Sharp's bureau proved invaluable to the Army's success, representing a new chapter in American military intelligence operations. For the Confederates, the lessons were harsher. Lee acknowledged the critical impact of Stuart's absence during the crucial days before the battle. In his official report, he noted, "The movements of the Army preceding the Battle of Gettysburg had been much embarrassed by the absence of cavalry." This understated critique masked a deeper recognition. Modern armies required systematic intelligence, collection and analysis, not just daring cavalry raids. The intelligence lessons of Gettysburg would influence the remainder of the war. Both armies emphasized improved scouting and signal operations. The Union expanded Sharp's Bureau of Military Information, while the Confederates developed more structured intelligence gathering systems to compensate for their increasing material disadvantages. Beyond the immediate military consequences, the intelligence story of Gettysburg offers profound insights into the evolving nature of warfare. The battle marked a transition point where systematic intelligence began to supersede the heroic individual reconnaissance mission. The Union's more methodical approach to intelligence, using multiple sources, creating dedicated analytical units, and integrating signal intelligence with human reports, presaged modern military intelligence practices. The human drama of these intelligence operations often went unnoticed in accounts focused on the fighting itself. Yet behind every crucial decision lay the work of scouts who crept through enemy lines, signal officers who strained their eyes through field glasses, and intelligence officers who pieced together fragmentary reports into coherent assessments. Consider Lieutenant James E. Taylor of the Union Signal Corps, who spent 3 days on Little Round Top tracking Confederate movements, or Confederate scout William Dalton, who disguised himself as a civilian to gather information on Union positions, but was captured and nearly executed as a spy. These individual stories, largely forgotten, shaped the larger narrative of the battle. As in the war progressed, both armies incorporated the intelligence lessons from Gettysburg. By 1864, reconnaissance had become more systematic, with dedicated units assigned to collect and analyze information. Signal stations, observation balloons, and networks of scouts became standard components of military operations. The legacy of Gettysburg's intelligence operations extended far beyond the Civil War. The techniques developed by Sharp's Bureau became foundational for future American military intelligence. During the Spanish-American War and World War I, officers studied the Gettysburg campaign for lessons on battlefield intelligence. Perhaps most significantly, Gettysburg demonstrated that in modern warfare, commanders could no longer rely solely on what they could see with their own eyes. The battlefield had grown too large, forces too dispersed, and movements too complex. Success now depended on building intelligence systems that could pierce the fog of war. When Dwight Eisenhower toured the Gettysburg battlefield 80 years later, preparing for the Allied invasion of Europe, he noted the parallels between Lee's intelligence challenges and those facing modern commanders. The fundamental problems, he observed, remain constant across time: knowing where the enemy is, understanding his strength, and anticipating his intentions. As visitors walk the grounds of Gettysburg today, they typically focus on the dramatic moments of combat: Pickett's charge, Little Round Top, the wheat field. Yet the true story of the battle begins earlier and extends beyond the Pennsylvania fields where it was fought. It is a story of information, of knowledge and its absence, of seeing and failing to see. In the end, Gettysburg was won and lost not just by the courage of soldiers in combat, but by the success and failure of the intelligence operations that guided them there. The battle reminds us that even the bravest army fights blind without the illumination that good intelligence provides, a lesson as relevant in today's information-dominated battlefields as it was on those fateful days in 1863.